ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these tutorials over at my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video tutorial, we are looking at the ever so exciting topic of writing complex custom functions. Basically, we're going to be breaking problems down into little bits. Now, if you haven't written a custom function before, especially a complex one, this is not a video to really be afraid of, because what I'm going to show you in this video is a process that you can use to break things down so that larger complex problems really don't seem that scary. You basically just break everything down into its smaller bits. Let's take a look at the file, what I tried to accomplish, and see how you can write complex custom functions. Alright, so let's dive in. The first thing you need to know is, what was the problem that I'm trying to solve? Well, quite simply, I needed to write a parser for US addresses for FileMaker. Now, there is one thing that you need to know whenever you're going to consider tackling any type of complex problem within FileMaker. That is, does the code already exist? Now, I'm here on the FileMaker Magazine website, and there is an area right here, Resources. If you go onto the magazine website, you're going to find the FileMaker custom functions. Now, one of the longest running and most popular is the Brian Dunning website. A lot of people still post functions there, but there's also some competing sites such as FM Functions, and if you really know where to look, then you can find some custom functions, some really good custom functions from personal repositories on a place called GitHub. So this link right here, if we click this custom functions on this site, it's simply going to take you to an article where I list a number of custom functions. Brian Dunning, again, has one of the longest running. FM Functions is also very popular, a very prolific poster, Fabrice Nordman. He actually posts a lot of really good custom functions. Then you have the Filemaker Standard, something that I started back in 2010, where collaborators have contributed there. Charles Ross has a very complex, not complex, but complete listing of a lot of custom functions he's created. And then Jeremy Bonte also has a GitHub repo, and there are others that aren't even listed here. If you know of some, please send them to me, and I'll make sure to put them in my listing here. So, parsing a US address. I went on the hunt looking for where I could actually find a custom function, hoping that somebody has already done this for me. Now, I went to Brian Dunning's website, and fortunately, when I went into his search, I actually put in the word address. I did my search, and you have to really sort of know what you're looking for in terms of going through things. I look at this CIDR RIP. That's really not going to tell me what I want, but as I scrolled down, I found this one called FN Address Parser, which looked pretty interesting. So I clicked in and I went to that particular custom function. I thought, okay, this is pretty cool because it shows you your sample input. I can input this address of 123 West 3rd Street, Los Angeles, and it will output the top part, the bottom part, and the next part. Okay, this gets me where I want to go, but I wanted it to be a little bit more specific. I wanted things to break down into, I want to know what is the actual state versus the zip versus the city versus the apartment number versus the street and the number of the street and all these different things. So I also happen to look at the code. It's always good to be able to review the code. Once you get really good with coding in FileMaker, you sort of know whether something is really good code or not. It's good code. It accomplishes what you want, but it doesn't do it in necessarily the most efficient fashion. And I'll tell you why. As I scan through here, I see a lot of case statements. And when I'm looking at this, I start to see a lot of pattern counts. When you see a lot of pattern counts within FileMaker, a custom function, you know that it's doing a lot of work. You also know that you can also tell that he's trying to anticipate every possible variation. Now, when you look at this and you zoom in here, you can see that he's anticipating for the variation of a space with av, a period, and then a space. And then here he's anticipating space and then av without a period. And here he's anticipating the full road type of avenue. Now, the problem that we're going to come across here is that the parsing will only work for all of the different circumstances or conditions that you can actually hit. So we need to find something that's a little bit more comprehensive. I also noticed that when I was working with some of my addresses were using different types of designations for road types beyond those just listed in this function. Now, there are always resources that you can find in order to get canonical list of things in order to find out information. In this particular example, the creator of this function, Andrew, really only anticipated what his immediate needs were. And in fact, my custom function ended up satisfying my needs. But we're going to look at the process that I went through in order to find code that will help me write a little bit more of an efficient address parser. So the next place that I went was to Filemaker Functions. I searched here, same thing I did on Brian Dunning's site. I typed in address, and you're really not going to find anything on this website. At this point, I know I've gone to two of the major websites, or the major sites for FileMaker custom functions, and the first one really didn't do what I want to do. The next step to take was, okay, there are other there are other programming languages out there that I know have parsed these US addresses. In fact, I happen to know that there is a very, very large repository of code within the world of Perl, because it's been around a really long time, and today all the rage is JavaScript. So of course, my next step was a Google search. So by going to a Google search, it's always important that you put in pretty specifically what you're looking for. So parse US address is pretty specific, and it came up with a lot of hits in terms of what I wanted to find. Now, right off the bat, we see this GitHub right here. GitHub datamade US address, a Python library. Now, off the bat, I have to ask myself, do I have access to Python? Well, if I'm working on FileMaker, I do. The Beeswax plugin, Bbox, is a free plugin that will access Python. It works on Macintosh, but I know that on Windows, you actually need to have Python installed, and running the plugin and installing a plugin, that's a lot of work. At this stage, I'm really trying to avoid having to write my own custom FileMaker function for parsing addresses. I just want to find the code that's already been done. Well, as we scroll down here, we find this other one that says parse address npm. Now, if you're not familiar with npm, it's basically called Node Package Manager. And what this is Node is a JavaScript library, or it's a server-side execution of JavaScript in terms of running JavaScript on the server. So Node is extremely popular right now, and knowing that, I simply clicked on that link and brought up the npm library. So what this did is it pointed me in the path that I was sort of already thinking. And if you look at the code is not too confusing, but we can see right here as we scroll over, we've got this address right here. This is just one example of an address. 105 North Gravestein Highway, Sebastopol, California. Now, it's really important to recognize that addresses can come in a wide variety of input formats. For example, there could be a period after North. There could be a comma after Gravestein or Gravestein. There could be a comma after Highway. There could be a comma after Sebastopol. There could be a comma after California. There could be multiple spaces in between all of these different areas. There could be an apartment number. There are so many different aspects to an address that writing a parser can really get pretty complex. You know, if you're going to approach this, you're going to be heading down a very long path of accounting for many different variables and many different possible results. So the goal would be, can I use this code right here directly within FileMaker? And in fact, you can use JavaScript right within FileMaker within the browser. But as we're soon going to see, I came across a problem where running it within a web viewer and making a full round trip really was pretty cost intensive and not something that I was willing to wait for. Ultimately, I ended up writing the custom function, but I did it with the help of this existing code. So let's take a look at that process and then walk through a FileMaker file to see how I actually approached the problem. Now, the really neat thing about existing code is that many times it will point you to resources and provide you with code that you can use yourself even when you're composing something within FileMaker Pro. So, here we go. Over here is a file that I started called parse US address. I knew I was headed for creating a lot of different types of addresses, all the different ways that people can enter those, with commas, without commas, with apartments, without apartments. Some have numbers, some don't have zip codes. Really some complex code. And I'm going to show you how I actually approached this piece by piece. But first I needed the resources. So looking back over at that web page of parse address of a node package, which was basically pointing to the fact that this is a node port that we right here for Perl geo street address US. So basically in Perl, there was somebody who took the time to write code to parse an address in Perl. This person in turn basically rewrote what was written in Perl in JavaScript for Node.js. And then I, in turn, took the Node.js port and then used that as my reference for creating the FileMaker address parser for my own use and for yours as well. It's what you get to benefit from. So if we go take a look at the code, it's going to open up a GitHub website. We've opened up GitHub. We can see right here that it's actually pointing to the geo street US address, which is going to then give you more information. So here I've got two different pages. I've got the GitHub page of the JavaScript format of the address parser, and I've got the code from Perl, from CPAN, which is the repository for all of the Perl code, and I can take a look at that as well. It's going to give you examples, and the great thing is by looking at other code, you become familiar with how this code is actually formatted. Well, ultimately, without going into the Perl and without going too in-depth on the code here, what I did is I ultimately downloaded the code. You can do that from GitHub. There's download links here. If you know how to do a git pull, you can do that. If you don't, you can actually look at it right here on the web page. So if you're concerned about having to use some type of version control, don't. You can simply click on this link right here, address.js, on this parse address. And the code is right there. In fact, here within his code, he actually has a direct link within the comments to go to the Perl version of the code that he referenced. So this is what's great about all of the code that's out there in the world. You can use the resources that you're provided with. And as I scroll through this, you can see quite clearly that the resources that we gain is all of the lists are already done for us. So as I scroll through this, you can see that we have street type, and it has all of the different street types: alley, annex, AV, avenue, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. These are all of the massive, extensive list of all of the different US street types. Now, what's really cool about this is if you did take the time, like I did, and went and actually looked at this code right here, and we'll open up a new web browser, we'll paste that in, it'll load it, and as it loads and we scroll down here, we even get to code that actually tells us really cool things such as this: abbreviated street type, e.g. road, street, avenue, etc. See the USPS official type abbreviations at, and there's a link for us right there. A link that points to the canonical resource from the US Postal site that actually tells us what are all of the possible street types. So by going to these resources, we're able to build our compendium of all the information that we need in order to successfully parse a US address within FileMaker. So ultimately, that's what I did. I didn't necessarily go to the actual link. In fact, this will resolve, I believe, incorrectly. You have to do some further research because the US Postal Service changed that on us. I ultimately did go to that. But for my purposes, I knew that the code that I was going to use, the code from the Node module, was already going to have everything that I need. So I downloaded it from this GitHub repository, and I ultimately loaded it into my editor. And here is all of the code. Now, the cool thing about using a good text editor outside of FileMaker is that you can do things really pretty quick. So let's do a quick little example here. One, within this particular editor, in fact, a lot of editors, they allow you to grab things within blocks. such as that right there. So I can grab all of those values. In fact, if I want all of these values, I can grab all of those, and I'm holding down the Option key in this particular editor, which is called Sublime. It allows me to grab this block of text and then get it into a successful FileMaker format. So I hold down the Option key in this particular editor, and it may vary for you, but I can copy that, and I have this other window over here where I can do all of my FileMaker work. Now in this example, it's really pretty easy. It already has all of the quotes around for me, and I simply just need to change these commas into ending semicolons. So I use the find and the search and replace within this editor, and I simply say I want to find a comma and I want to replace it with all my semicolons, and I just do that replace. What I have is I instantly have now a list value that allows me to put this into my FileMaker custom function right like that. That's what I want to do by leveraging all of the existing code that's out there in the rest of the world, whether it comes from FileMaker or not. So ultimately, I did that for all of the directional parts, the street types, and then as you scroll down, you're going to see that's a very long list of street types. I have state codes. I was able to extract all of those, all that work being done for me. The long version of state names and the short versions I was able to pull out and ultimately build my list of everything that I wanted to do within this custom function. What's also beneficial is knowing how to read some other languages. Now, I realize that you may not know anything but FileMaker. But if you have learned FileMaker, then it really doesn't take a whole lot in order to spend a little bit of time to read other languages and see what they're actually doing. Mostly because most programming languages really attempt to be highly readable. For example, function, capitalize. I know what it's doing. It's capitalizing thing. Keys, object.keys. Okay, a little obscure, but I don't need to know about it. For each, that's pretty reasonable. So it's grabbing values here using a function, grabbing the keys, and for each of those keys, it's doing something where it's pushing and pulling to an array. Okay, I don't need to know JavaScript in order to get this right off the bat, but I'm able to get a sense as I scan through this code, essentially what it's doing. Now, the big problem that we have in FileMaker as we scroll down here is that FileMaker, and I've been griping about this for years and years, going back all the way to the 2000s, early 2000s, I don't understand why in all of the rest of all other programming languages, they all have support for regular expressions. It's a free library that FileMaker could include in FileMaker, but yet they haven't done it for decades and decades, but it's still been there. Probably because such a small percentage of developers know and use regular expressions. But yet regular expressions is a pattern matching tool that allows you to do some very cool things, such as if I find a particular space character, whether it's a tab or a space or a non-breaking space or whatever it is, if I find one of those and then I find a sequence of however many follow those before I get to an actual character, such as a letter A through Z, I want you to simply do something to that, or I want to change that, or extract it, or do all kinds of other things. Regular expressions is a very powerful tool that developers can use that is well worth the investment of time in order to use. Now, that's what this whole library uses. That's what this parse address node port of a Perl module actually uses, is regular expressions. The Perl module used regular expressions, but we really don't have access to that in FileMaker. So my first attempt was this. As I switch over to my FileMaker files, I simply took the time to implement the actual code within a FileMaker file. So here I have a FileMaker file called parse-address. This was my first attempt, thinking, okay, I'm going to be able to use this code without having to write a parser myself. Here's what I do typically to quickly get JavaScript or other code, well, primarily JavaScript because I'm using it with a web viewer, into FileMaker. I simply open the code within a text editor, select all of it, copy it, come into FileMaker, select the text tool, and then paste it. I then give that object a name, such as we see right here, text.js.xregex. So that's basically an enhanced regular expression library for JavaScript, because that's what the code that was written by the person who wrote the parse address node module, right here actually does. It needs that library as a dependency. So what I did is I loaded it into a web viewer. Here's the web viewer code. I actually did do a separate test in order to figure out how to actually make this a little bit faster. I wrote a test where I was actually writing the files out from container fields into FileMaker's temporary space. That's where you can see the reference right here where it's referencing the file of the library of the regexall.js and the parseaddress.min.js. But once those two libraries were actually exported and I was referencing them here in the web viewer, all I had to do was run this small little 3-line piece of code. In fact, this line isn't even needed. The only line that was needed in order to parse an address is that right there. Parse address dot parse location, and then what's the address you want to parse? And that code was going to do it all for me. Now I have a little bit of a switch set up here where I've set up this thing that says if JS run, then run this code. Otherwise, if not JS run. So this is a little trick that you can do with JavaScript. If you're going to do JavaScript within a web viewer, you can tell that JavaScript when to run or when not to run based on whether or not a global variable is set. And that's a really handy way of basically using a web viewer to execute JavaScript code, but only when you want, because you can set, as a result of a button or whatever action, you can set a global variable to be true, and then the web viewer will actually evaluate. Otherwise, you can set that global variable to false, and the web viewer will not take the time to parse the address or to parse the code and run it. Now, the problem was this regex library is very large, and then this parse address min may not have been optimized in terms of the code. So the problem that I hit is when I go back into browse mode, even though the code will work, watch what happens when I click get address. 1,1000, 2,1000, 3. It takes almost 2 seconds in order for that code to be loaded into the web viewer, run, and then the result using an FMP URL being passed back. But you can see that it does do its job. It basically takes all of the constituent parts of an address, no matter how complex that address is, uses the regular expressions within JavaScript, parses it, and then puts it back into a format that allows me to extract and recompile the address in whatever format I want. We can see that it's JavaScript or JSON format. So JSON format basically is a name pair. The key is number, there's the number. The key is street, there's the street. The key is type, there's the type of street. The key is city, and there's the city. State, and so on. So knowing that JSON is a pretty popular format, I said, you know what? I'll go ahead and I will use that as my ending format for my custom function as well. So this is where I started the process of writing the custom function. Let's break that down, show you the file, see how I created some tests, and how you can do the same thing if you're writing your own complex custom function. All right, so we're finally at the point where we've decided, you know what, JavaScript isn't going to work. I don't want to set up a web viewer. There is nothing in FileMaker that I'm able to do. I need this to work on iOS. I can't have plugins on iOS. I'm not going to use a Perl, Python, or JavaScript library. Okay, I have to just write this within FileMaker. So the cool thing is referencing other code allows you to pull a lot of information and resources from that code. We've already seen that by taking a look at the code and knowing that we can pull all of the references to all of the different street types, all of the different directional parts, north, northeast, east, southwest, etc. We know we can't use the regular expressions because FileMaker doesn't have it, but we can also use one of the cool things that most other languages have, and FileMaker can be done as well, and that's known as tests. So when you're creating something super complex with a lot of different variables, tests allow you to be assured that your code is going to work. And whenever you're going to write a complex FileMaker custom function, having tests is a great way to go. So over here, I have the test.js, which I pulled from the node module. That's why a lot of the addresses are going to be the same. And a test essentially works like this. I'm going to run an assertion. An assert is actually the call of a function in a lot of different languages, Java and JavaScript, I believe, in particular, or excuse me, Java in particular. And basically what that assert is, I'm going to give you a piece of information, but I'm also going to give you what I expect as a result from that piece of information. So if we look at this, we can see what we have. Here is our piece of information, and our assertion is, as a result, we need this number from the number, we need this street from the street, we need this type from the string, and we also need this zip code. Now, given all of those individual parts, we're stating that these are what I need as a result of my code running across this. Well, we need to do the exact same thing within FileMaker, and a lot of developers don't necessarily take the time to do this. They simply just go in and create their function, pass it a couple of pieces of information, and then see whether they get the result that they're looking for. When you're writing complex code, you need to write tests, especially across a number of things, because that's going to help you verify that your code works as you expect. So the first thing that we need to say is, where do we actually write our custom function? And as I have this FileMaker file in front of you, and it's the copy that you're able to get as a subscriber of the website as well, it's easier to write your FileMaker code within FileMaker than it is to write it within the calculation areas of FileMaker. The only frustrating part is that occasionally your code gets messed up, and you have to go in and actually debug it within the area where the FileMaker syntax checker will actually check your code. That's within the data viewer. If you're using FileMaker Advanced, under Tools, you have access to the data viewer. The data viewer is where you can create a watch variable where you can start to basically compose and test your code. This is also where you bring your code, if you're going to write your code within a FileMaker field, and you can actually find out where an error is happening. Now, it's not necessarily convenient to continually write code here within the data viewer, because you have to constantly go in and out of the dialog box, and you're not able to make your changes and see your results really quickly. So I chose to write all of my FileMaker code within just a normal FileMaker field. In fact, in this database, when we go into this, we're going to see that we basically have the ability to do this in any FileMaker file. In fact, top FileMaker developers, which we're going to see where I pulled Json Functions from Dan Smith, they will oftentimes write tests in order to verify and validate their code. So that's what I've done here. First, I have this one field of a global field, hence it's all in caps according to FileMaker standards, that is our calc. So I basically want this one calculation or this one field to have calculation code that's going to apply across all of my records. No problem. On each record, I'm going to have an address. That address can be completely unique from all of the rest of the addresses. Sometimes it uses commas, sometimes it doesn't. Some have numbers, some don't. Some have zip codes, some don't. Ultimately, I need a result, and that's going to be another field. It's a calculated field that's unstored that's going to use the evaluate function to evaluate that global calculation. And finally, I have my tests. All of my individual results need to be a certain thing. I, as a human, can definitely look at an address and simply pull out the parts. I know where the divisions happen in the event that commas aren't there. And it breaks down into all of these constituent parts for a US address. The number, the street, the type of street, a prefix, a suffix, zip code, state, unit type, unit number, city, possible street 1 and possible street 2. And as we're going to see, I didn't necessarily feel that it was important for me to parse addresses that had just the intersection of two streets. But of course, you're going to have this code now, and you're able to expand on this if you do need that functionality built into this code. Finally, we have an pass or fail. This also is an unstored calculation that basically results in the fact of, did we get the expected results that we wanted? So here's what I had to do. I had to go across each record of the 60 that are in this database that I have and simply take out all of the parts. I, as a human, know that this is the number, this is the street type, and this is the zip code. We therefore don't have a state. But you can see that as I scroll through this, what we're going to see is we've got green positive test passes, and we have red initial fails, meaning this is not actually parsing out according to my code the way that I would like it in order to get all of the parts. And we can look at the results right here, which we're going to see shortly as I go through all of the code and how I broke this down in FileMaker. So as you scroll through this file, you'll see a number of passes, but you'll also see a number of fails, meaning my code is not complete. It is not accounting for or finding certain parts out of addresses because it takes a long time to write complex FileMaker code. But let's get on to that code. We know now that we have a database that is going to provide us with a pass-fail result, and we're able to modify our code up here in this global calculation area. Let's take a look at the code over in my editor and see what was the process that I take. How do you actually break things down? Now, there's one really good address all the way down at the bottom here, which was a test that I put in right here. We can see that this address is just an absolute mess. It has a number of spaces in front. It's got a number of spaces behind. It only has one comma. There is no comma after the P.O. box. California is lowercase, which isn't really that big of a deal, and it's got a period after California, and it's got this information right here. Now, if you think about the very beginning part of this video, when I was talking about the fact that that original code that I found on Brian Dunning's website used a lot of case statements and a lot of pattern counts. The process of parsing or breaking data down allows you to take a reverse approach. Rather than just working with the data that you have alone, as it is, one of the very common things to do within coding in any language is to force the data that you have into a structure that you know you can trust. So this is a really easy concept to get because it makes sense. If I have multiple spaces between all of these different pieces of data, all I have to do is simply replace all of those spaces with what I want them to be. And that can be a single space, it can be an underscore, it can be whatever I want. I also know that I can break down things by simply taking out certain characters. I have to ask myself, does a period really have any value or meaning in terms of breaking this address down? When I look at this example right here, these commas do have meaning. They basically split the address into its constituent parts. So in some cases, I may get those commas, but in some cases, I may not. I can't 100% rely on them, but I do know that there are some things that I can do, and that's the process of normalization. I'm going to normalize my data into a structure that I can rely on. And if we take a look at the code, we're going to see that that normalization happens up at the top. It's the very first part of the code. The first thing that I do is I'm going to create a variable within a let statement, and I'm going to say, I want to normalize this address. Now, if I'm going to be doing some parsing, it's very important that many times I need to modify the data so that it fits my expectations. And in this case, I'm putting a space at the beginning, and I'm also putting a space at the end. And if you read the code and go through this code, you'll find out why. In order to actually pull a number off, or in order to do further substitutions later on down in the code, many times you need to modify the data by giving it either a space or a return in front, especially if you're going to look for a return as part of a pattern count or a search or what have you. The address is what's inbound, and you can see right here I'm taking all commas and I'm replacing them with a space, comma, space. I still need the comma because the comma might delimit for me automatically all of the different parts of the address. But I'm also going to be breaking things down based on spaces. I'm going to convert all periods into a space. I'm going to convert all 3 spaces into a single space, all double spaces into a single space, and that should get rid of all spaces that are either 2 or 3, which breaking it down that way means that it should convert all extra spaces into a single space. I'm also going to do a little bit of a trick up at the top where if I find the hash sign, I'm going to convert that to one of my known conversions of a unit type, such as apartment. And that's because I ended up finding out that using the filter values function across the hash didn't actually work. This was just a little bit of a bug that FileMaker has, where if you provide it with just a single value hash, filter values function wouldn't work. So ultimately, I'm not going to be able to walk through the whole of the code, but we can skim down to the bottom and take a look at the constituent parts that do make up the bulk of the logic that basically parses an address within FileMaker. Directionals, I took those all from that code that we copied. Units, I had to create this based on regular expressions: apartment, buildings, departments, floors, hangars. States, we have all of those right here, the short list abbreviation. States long, we have all of those. So I had to break up my code so that it looked and worked a little bit different, because FileMaker's code works different. Streets, here's our super long list, and here's actually the valid URL within the code that I went and found of the USPS list of all of the different possible street types. Now, if you can imagine, here's an interesting thing right here, crescent. You have to know that is there the potential that a street name is going to be Crescent Street instead of Maple Crescent, where crescent is the suffix to maple as the street versus Crescent Street being the actual name of the street? That's going to happen. That's where you need your tests and need to create a file that includes tests so that you can break things down and account for those different variables. So as we scroll down, I'm just going to give you a quick walkthrough of the code. Everything from this point, from line 726 all the way down, is the code that I had to come up with in order to create all of the parsing. And really, I'm going to have to leave this up to you, because otherwise explaining this would take another 2 or 3 hours to explain what's going on. But you can see how I broke things down based on how I created my result. Now, as a complex custom function, this is just one massive let function. But this let function simply does an iterative process, breaking things down piece by piece. In fact, you'll see that I had to put the actual address into multiple different formats in order to make all kinds of determinations. For example, here's has commas 3, has commas 2, has comma 1, address parts comma. I have to get a comma count. You can see above there, above the has 3 commas. So there's so many different variables in the address that you really have to walk through, break them down, and account for them. Now, one of the coolest and easiest things that I was able to find out, on an address, you can use FileMaker's left words to get the leftmost first word, and you can use its right words in order to get the right word. If the right word is a number, then most likely it's a zip code. If the left word is a number, then most likely it's a number. The number for the address, I should say. So you can see right here that I've got last word, first word, has number, has zip. If you start to find individual parts out of your data that are known, you can then take the further developer approach and say, now that I have my known parts of my data, I want to remove those from my data. So as we look at this right here, my result, up at the top is my actual result, what I wanted to end up with, and that is JSON code of FileMaker parts of all of the address pieces. But here underneath, I have my resulting code. That is all of the different results that I have within all of this code. I need to be able to see them as I develop. So this is a very effective way of taking a look at the results of your code, but excluding the results of that code from your ultimate result. And I'll show you how I did that. So here you can see that we've got the actual address with all of its spaces removed. Or I should say, here is an example where we've got all of these spaces that were included that were extra. Well, here it is with it, all of the spaces converted to 1, the dots removed. You can see spaces on either side of the comma. You can see spaces on either side of the whole of the address. Here's another version of the data converted where all spaces are removed. The reason that I did that is think about a P.O. box. Maybe somebody puts a P period, forgets the period after the O, and basically forgets the space after box, or puts P period, O period, and puts it correctly. Well, the easiest way to find out whether it has P.O. Box is to remove all spaces, all punctuation, and then simply just look for the string of P.O. Box. So that's another way that you can actually parse data, is take out everything and just collapse it down into no spaces. Here you're going to see, like in this particular example, if I do find a count of 2 commas, then why don't you go ahead and give me the version of that with the commas converted into returns? That's made the work for me easier because that person entered the data with commas. Whereas a lazy person who doesn't enter it with commas makes me do a little bit more work. But ultimately you can see what I've done here as you scroll down is I'm actually returning all of the individual results of all of the individual variables within the let function. So let's look at the very bottom of the code here, the resulting part of this massive let function. As we get down to the bottom, you can see that right here at this opening bracket, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm returning my result. That's the result of what I want. It is the JSON format. And I'm able to use that as the first line. So I know out of this result, I can write my tests against get value line 1 or get value 1. That's going to return my top line, which allows me to compare each of the values that I expect against the values that my FileMaker function is returning. But in order to see everything, I'm going to append to that, which you can see right here, debugging and testing. I'm going to append to that with the concatenator operator, an if statement that basically says if true. And here's the easiest part. Once I put and copy all of this custom function into an actual FileMaker custom function, all I have to do is change that true to false. So we scroll down to the bottom right here, look at our code here in our FileMaker function, where we have the debugging if true, just simply if false. And then what you're going to see is on each and every line, my custom code for the custom function is now returning just the result without all of my debugging code. So this is a very important trick to know when you're writing a complex calculation, especially within FileMaker, that if you want to see your debugging code, such as the address after I've modified all the spaces, the address with no spaces, the address parts that have a comma and split out, the address minus the parts that I've known and identified, such as the number and the zip code, the address remaining after I've done some extra modification, and are there any extra numbers? What's the first word that you found? The last word? Does it have a zip? Does it have a number? P.O. Box. What is the directional part, the street type, the unit, state long, short, city, zip? You get the idea. Do I want to see my debugging? If I do, I'm simply going to say true. And it's going to give me all of my debugging code. It's going to give me my result. It's going to allow me to run my tests and be able to make sure that across all of the different variations that I put into this database, I'm getting a passing result for the things that I do want that pass. Now, as I scroll up here, I want you to make note that as I stated, I didn't actually work on the code so that it would work for things such as I'm not parsing this where it's got opening and closing parentheses. My code is also not working on intersections of streets such as Mission and Valencia streets, San Francisco, without commas. If you want to take the time and hack on the code, you can definitely do that. Most all of the information is here. You can basically test for the ampersand. If the ampersand is there and there are no commas and we have a street match out of streets, basically all of the code is here in order to further evolve this code so that it ultimately would pass as many tests as possible. Now, if you're interested in testing, within this file, in its custom functions, which I've just opened up using a key command, we can see I've used some JSON functions in order to parse the data out of the format that I put it into. I put the ending resulting data into a JSON format because I know that JSON is a very effective method for parsing things. FileMaker doesn't currently have native JSON parsing, but there is a set of functions that are provided by Dan Smith. So here we have another example of tests that are run on code. The file that Dan actually provides, and I'll actually go over to the web browser so that we can take a look at this. Let's go to GitHub, Dan Smith 65, and I believe it's right here, FileMaker Json Functions. I believe that is the file, functions, FM files. If that's not the one, then it's FileMaker JSON right here. And maybe that is the function. It's one of the two. Dan has both FileMaker Functions and FileMaker Custom Functions. And the one that I'm using is his set of custom functions. His file also has a full suite of testing set up to make sure that his custom functions do exactly what he wants. And this is just another example that you can look at if you're writing complex FileMaker calculation code where you need to have multiple different tests and know whether or not those tests give you the result of what you want, whether they pass or whether they fail. I think as I scroll through here, there were some tests that were a few that were failing, but ultimately the goal is to get 100% passing ratio. My code does not do that, but by and large, it will process most of your common addresses outside of the few edge cases that we find within this file. You have the file, you now have the knowledge, you have the information, normalize your data, leverage existing code that's out there, pull the pieces from that code, and basically make the code work the way that you want it to work. This was a very fun example for me to go through. It was many hours of code, so I hope that this code will save you a lot of time if you end up with data that you get that wasn't under your control in terms of how you enter it, and you basically have to parse that information out. This is a great start to a very comprehensive US parsing address code within FileMaker. If you're going to work through it, enhance it, and make it better, by all means, please send it back to me and I will update it and make it available on the website. And as well, I may set up a GitHub repository. So as always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development. And until next time, happy FileMaking. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.